can hear me
Hello.
okay?
Hi.
Hey, I see Henrik. I see Anna,
Hi.
Anne, and I don't see Genesee yet, but I assume she'll be joining in just a minute. Oh, hey, Genesee. So we actually have 3 people listed as Jesse here and 1 Hendrik. So Henrik, we outnumber you.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe you should rename yourselves, but
Yeah. I think it was because people joined through my link.
oh,
But at any rate, I initially titled this panel Psychedelics as Tikkun Olam. And the reason I did so is because that meme of Tikkun Olam it's part of my own personal memetic framework with which I approach the world. Because the concept itself, I think, is super relevant for right now. And Tikkun Olam means repairing the world. And the idea is that each of us is born into this earth with this obligation of Tikkun Olam, repairing the world. And it's an ancient Jewish concept, and I think that's relevant now because today is the last day of the 10 days of the remembrance of the Holocaust. So in psychedelics, and people who are in psychedelic circles, or anybody who's been to an ayahuasca ceremony, you may have heard this concept of Tikkun Olam referred to as the work, as in, shit, I did a bunch of work last night in the ceremony. And that work is what we're here to talk about today, the work of repairing the world. So I'm very pleased to introduce you to my 3 esteemed panelists, Henrik from the Mind Foundation, Genesee from Sage Institute for Psychedelic Therapy, and Anne Wagner from Remedy. So starting with you, Henrik, who are you and what does your organization do?
hi. I'm Henrik Rabede. I usually live in Berlin. Now I'm in the south of Germany. My background is in public health, psychotherapy, and drug research. I had been working at the University of Heidelberg for 18 years and started the Mind Foundation together with a lot of interesting people 3.5 years ago. Last week, we received the first, probably one of the highest government grants for psychedelic research ever. That was 2.2 million for a psilocybin depression study that we're about to start in summer. And beyond that, I consider myself a thinker and researcher, bringing together different disciplines from cultural studies to biology.
Wow, congratulations, Hendrik. A huge grant, 2.2 million. And you guys are a nonprofit, is that correct?
We're a nonprofit, yeah. But of course, this grant was not granted to us only, but to a group of 2 universities that we brought together. We're happy to bring together, and the 3 of us, the 3 organizations, are going to start that in the German cities of Mannheim and Berlin.
Well, that's really interesting, especially in light of this week, Compass Pathways, a for-profit psychedelic assisted therapy company based in the UK, but working in the US, announcing the closing of an $80 million Series B round for their work on psilocybin for the treatment of depression. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that after the introductions. Moving on to Genesee. Genesee, who are you and what does your organization do?
Hi. So yeah, I'm a psychologist. I practice in Berkeley, and I currently work with 2 different organizations. One of them is Sage Integrative Health, which I founded in June of 2018, and we're an integrative health clinic where we also offer psychedelic assisted therapies as they become legal through a holistic approach. And then just last year, I co-founded Sage Institute, which is a low-fee psychedelic assisted therapy clinic. We're currently offering ketamine assisted therapy and training center. So we train therapists who are working towards their licensure in psychedelic assisted therapies. We plan to start a research arm of Sage Institute as well in the next year. So we're still getting that together. And then I sort of have a third hat, which is that I'm a therapist on the MAPS MDMA for PTSD team in San Francisco.
So you guys are actively doing the work.
Yeah, we are. Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. And full disclosure, I have the privilege of being involved with Sage Institute. I sit on the board of directors, which is an absolute honor.
We're really lucky to have you, Jesse.
And Anne, coming from Canada, could you please introduce yourself and what your organization does?
Sure. I'm Anne Wagner. I'm also a clinical psychologist. I'm in Toronto. And I would say I'm predominantly a researcher. So I'm the founder of Remedy, and I'm also an adjunct professor at Ryerson University in Toronto. And so Remedy is a center for mental health innovation. And so right now, it's interesting, we're actually a little bit of the flip of Sage. So we've started with our research arm, and then we are going to be, we're in the process of creating a charitable arm as well. So right now, we're structured as a for-profit, but we run all of our research in collaboration with Ryerson University. And so that's in a not-for-profit framework. And the work that I specifically do is I'm focused on treatment development research. So I've run studies with MAPS in the past. We did a couple study for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder with MDMA. And I recently received Health Canada approval to run the first investigator-sponsored MDMA study in Canada, looking at cognitive processing therapy, which is an individual evidence-based treatment for PTSD with MDMA here at Remedy. And we have a few other projects in the works, but my real love is working with relational aspects of healing when it comes to psychedelic work. So we have a whole program that's going to be happening in that regard. And right now at Remedy, we do both the research as well as preparation and integration work. So we aren't offering psychedelic work outside of a research context yet here, but we plan to in the future when it becomes legal.
So that's so interesting. So you ran a couple study for the treatment of PTSD using MDMA. And I'll speak for myself and probably for many people watching, most of my initial introduction to MDMA was from that angle of interpersonal closeness in a couple's kind of context. Could you speak a little bit to the results of that study?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was really interesting. So I came to this work as a PTSD researcher. My background was not in psychedelics at all. And so when I started to learn more about MDMA and learning about its properties, both for couples work and for PTSD, it seemed like a really natural fit. And we are not the first people who have thought about this idea at all. This work with couples and MDMA has gone back from the first uses of MDMA in terms of a psychotherapeutic tool. So Anne Shulgin is someone who's pioneered this work, and she was, I think she gets the credit for being the very first person to ever do dyadic work with MDMA. And it's a really amazing tool to be able to not only have people feel like they're able to communicate, and especially communicate sensitive and emotional information that they may not otherwise feel comfortable or able to access. And when we're looking at folks with PTSD, this is tenfold, right? They are often very avoidant of their internal emotional experience. And so that has massive ramifications on your intimate partnerships as well as the rest of your interactions with people around you, your community, your world. And so what we found from that pilot study, so we ran that pilot study in Charleston, South Carolina, with our colleagues, Annie and Michael Mithofer. And we found some incredible results. So they're still under publication, but we've published a case study so far. And we found that 5 of the 6 individuals with PTSD no longer had PTSD. And 5 of the 6 had improved relationship satisfaction as well. And it was interesting. The ones that still had PTSD were the ones who were still struggling with their relationship, but saw some change in movement as well. And so it was really compelling, and we're really excited about bringing this out to a larger study.
I think those results are astounding. And governments around the world have seen results from studies like that and given breakthrough therapy designation, at least here in the US, to MDMA for the treatment of PTSD in 2017, to psilocybin for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression in 2018, and then just at the end of last year to psilocybin for the treatment of major depressive disorder, which is basically generalized depression. And as a result, we now have this framework for regulation that looks like to be pretty progressive, at least in the US. But I'm curious about what it's like across the pond. Henrik, what does the regulatory framework look like? Do you have breakthrough therapy designations for psychedelics that are being issued in the EU? Or how are you operating on the research side of things?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So Europe is working in a very different way. We have the European Medicines Agency, but the European Medicines Agency is not the FDA of Europe. We have like 27 states that have regulatory bodies of their own. So it's more like a body that is bringing regulations together. We in Germany are one of the, of course, we are the largest country in the European Union, very influential, and are one of the largest to, the last to start entering psychedelic research again. The last study with psilocybin was done here in 1973 about. So a long time, nothing has happened on the university level here in the clinical space. So there have been like animal studies, but not in the clinical space. We deliberately decided not to move forward with MAPS here in Germany because MDMA didn't sound like the substance that would make the progress that we are now trying to make with a psychedelic, mostly because of non-scientific, non-rational reasons, the reputation of MDMA. And so that's why we went for psilocybin. There is something like the breakthrough status that you can get in Germany through the EMA. It's called prime status. And which is actually helping you to go through to the phase 3 study phase of your research much quicker with less money. At the moment, we are not going into this direction. Our study will be a phase 2B study. We are also not thinking about competing with the players you have been alluding to, Usona and UK-based company. So I think the major message of that government grant is that you can do it now in Germany. Have a reputation. Your reputation will not be lost simply by doing research in that field. You can talk to the medical community. We had an amazing, after our own conference, we had an amazing meeting with about 1,000 medical professionals on their yearly conference. And there was something like a voting being done on should that research being done now in Germany or not. And 80% of these 1,000 doctors said, yeah, let's do it. We need to collect the data. And I think that was possible because of the progress that had been done in North America, and also by Compass in the UK. Yeah.
Well, it's great.
Can I add something, because you didn't ask me what you wanted to ask me before? The non-profit and for-profit side of things. Probably we'll have a debate about that a little bit later too, but that's a very North American debate in the polarization that I see there. So just to drop one thought, I think for-profits did very good things and very terrible things, but I also know a number of non-profits also in the psychedelic space that have big power issues going on. So it's more about the ethics of the players. It's a plan you're following. And maybe we can later talk about how to get these therapies out into the health system at all. I am not sure that we can do that on a nonprofit model.
Well, let's talk about that right now. I mean, I think this is a perfect segue into what I wanted to ask Sage Institute, prefacing the question with this. In 2006, when Muhammad Yunus won the Nobel Peace Prize in economics, he devoted his acceptance speech to redefining capitalism for the purpose of solving social problems. He said, if we want to make capitalism work for us, for the future of humanity, we have to make money solving social problems. And he came up with this term, social enterprise, that has been adopted since then. So I think a lot about this issue of how do we do ethical capitalism? How do we redefine capitalism for the purpose of solving social problems? And I dare say that Sage Institute has thought about it even more than I have. Genesee, could you speak a little bit to how you're addressing the problem of access to psychedelic medicines in this new form of capitalism, hybrid nonprofit for-profit model?
Sure. Yeah. That's something we thought a lot about, having started Sage Integrative Health as a for-profit, not because we wanted to make a big profit from the work that we were doing, but because we wanted to get some sort of reimbursement for all of the time and energy that we put into the business. But we did run into an issue that we were really kind of stumbling with finding ways to make the work accessible, particularly psychedelic assisted therapy. If you're doing it right, in my mind, there's a lot of human contact hours that go into the therapy itself. So it ends up being quite pricey, at least at first. The initial investment is quite pricey, where in the long term, it's arguable that it's actually less expensive than, other modes of treatment. But so we ended up thinking through, the various options and landing on a nonprofit model as our kind of sister organization to help us to increase accessibility. So that's why Sage Institute was formed. And there are two ways really that we're bringing in revenue at this point. One of them is through our sliding scale services. The model there is that we have intern psychotherapists who are still gaining their hours towards licensure, and so don't expect to be paid at the same rate as licensed psychotherapists. And meanwhile, we bring in donations through grants and other modes of fundraising. And this isn't perfect. Ideally, we would like to have a sustainable model where we're not needing to constantly seek out grants and donations. We do have a plan to increase our sustainability through creating a training center. As many people in the field know, there's a bottleneck around training psychedelic therapists. Right now, there's a really limited number of us out there, and many, many more that will be needed as legalization unfolds. So we hope to support the field in training more therapists, and through that, bringing in more revenue to support the sliding scale services.
So this really opens up the discussion of access. Like Henrik said, will the for-profit model or the nonprofit model be more effective in ensuring access? And so now I just open it up to all of you as to your thoughts on this subject and how we can make sure that in the wake of this COVID-19 crisis that has exacerbated mental health issues all over the world, we're going to have first responders dealing with PTSD, people dealing with anxiety and depression from sitting in their homes all days, and looking to psychedelics as a remedy. How do we ensure access? For-profit, nonprofit, hybrid models? What do you think?
Can I ask my colleagues back, just to make it more of a dialogue? Don't you think that comparing, we have the United States, we have Canada, we have Germany here. Germany never had that form of capitalism that unfolded in the United States, and Canada is also not like the United States. Would you agree that there is also a need to adjust the models to the health systems that you have nationally, maybe even in certain areas? I mean, we have a working health insurance system here, a state health insurance system and a private health insurance system. They somehow, in a confused way, work together, but actually it works. It works. So we have to come up with different solutions.
Absolutely. I think it's a completely different system and question really in the United States, where we don't have universal health care. If there was insurance available to pay for these treatments, then we wouldn't be struggling with this question. So yeah, I agree that we're going to need to think about it on a country by country basis, at least until we in the United States update our systems to catch up with yours and Canada's.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we're thinking through a number of different models of what this is going to look like in Canada. And one interesting component here is that mental health services, so accessing a psychologist or a social worker outside of a hospital setting, is not covered by our insurance, our provincial and national healthcare insurance. However, physicians are. So the interesting component of when we're thinking about psychedelic assisted work as we go forward will be this team model that we are hoping will be able to be billed under physicians. And so we'll be able to at least be able to fund portions of it through this intern physician type model that would allow greater access. And then also within this idea of this hybrid model that we're also using, we initially started it here at Remedy with the idea of funding research. And not being reliant on philanthropy or grants always to be funding the research going forward, because we're never sure if there's going to be the next grant that's available or someone who's wanting to fund the next study. And so our hope was to create a sustainable model to keep research going, to be able to provide the evidence base, to be able to use these treatments. Because one thing that I always am thinking about is we have such enthusiasm for the use of psychedelics and what's going to happen with legalization, but we know very little actually about their effective use with various different populations and different times and spaces. We draw a lot from anecdotal experience and from the limited trials that we have, but that's very like a small slice of what will happen in larger expanded use. So our model that we're using so far is that the profit from the for-profit component of Remedy, where people are paying for their psychological services, and they're often here actually paying through their insurance for their psychological services. So it's actually not coming out of their pocket, but we're receiving payment for that the profit there gets invested into the research. And so that way we're able to keep it going over time. So that's one way. And then also we are intending that we will be receiving donations for people to be able to access services when they're not covered by this hybrid physician intern model that we would hope for in the future through the charitable arm.
And I'm really glad that you mentioned the fact that the research at this point is focused on a very limited population. That's a big concern to us as well. And it's one of the things that we hope to contribute is to expand that scope and look at how this work impacts a number of different people and populations from diverse backgrounds.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Basically, a lot of the studies that have been done have been catering to the middle class standard patient, and that's really a hard problem in science to get in more diverse populations. So with the 144 patient study that we're beginning with, we're hoping to get a bunch of people in that are not so close to psychedelic use like they had been in the first studies in the field. Now, actually, also the MAP studies are more diverse than they had been in the beginning. But that's an open field for researchers all over the world. Does it work for people who don't have a certain form of education, who come from different cultural and social backgrounds? That's still an open question.
Absolutely. And, I think in the research fields in general, and in psychedelics in particular, the psychedelic field is inordinately white. And, I'm not sure exactly what the sort of racial and ethnic composition looks like in Germany, but in the United States, we're quite diverse and, about 50% white. And when you look at psychedelic research, it's something like 86% white. So it's a real problem. And I'm really glad to hear you're both thinking about this.
Here we are, four white people talking about it.
Exactly. And this seems to be particularly the case when we're talking about it. I notice on, many conferences, many panels, it's many white faces. And, living in Toronto, that is not what is exemplified here. And it's not the clients we see on a day-to-day basis at Remedy. So we're really hoping that by running our research here and working with our community organizations with which we have contacts and relationships, that we'll be able to really put a focus on diversity within our work.
The data that probably all of us read in the newspapers and in scientific papers, we know that a lot of people in the United States from Black communities, Asian communities, a lot more people died than the percentage in the population is. That is actually not the case in a lot of European countries here. Different reasons because of the different varieties of health insurance model. Also, the Swedish model is completely different from the German model. So there is nothing like a European health insurance model. But I also think that an interesting question is it really about ethnicity and social or racial backgrounds even, or is it about the networks that people need to make sense of psychedelic therapies? There seems to be some research in general psychotherapy research, but also in psychedelic research, that we shouldn't think about individuals going to a therapist only and then going back to wherever they come from, but it's actually this opportunity, this network of opportunities around them that helps them to recreate or stabilize a therapeutic experience. And that, of course, is a very vulnerable thing. How can you help people to recreate networks? Maybe we have, in the future, we have to rethink how more community-based aftercare or even preparation networks have to be built so that people who don't have the skills to make use of it can get better.
Yes, thank you for naming that. That's also very important. Both the question of, it's not really about the psychedelic ultimately. Those experiences are important, but it's about the integration, how we make use of it afterwards and are able to make sense of it and integrate it into our lives. And such a big piece of that is the community that holds us when we come back, and the people who are able to either to help us integrate, as opposed to either not wanting to hear about it, not being open to these kinds of experiences, or just not being available. There's so much isolation in our world right now. So yes, I think that focusing on our communities and expanding community support is an integral part of this work.
These keywords, community and networks and culture, speak to me as an anthropologist. Before I came to where I am now, I trained studying the anthropology of shamanism and indigenous peoples. And it gives me pause to think about what's happening here in psychedelic culture through the lens of that. Because we focus so much on psychedelic therapy in the clinical setting, but if you look at the landscape, most people outside of recreation are accessing psychedelics through a religious landscape, a quasi-religious setting of shamanic ceremonies where they drink ayahuasca in the Amazon or in a city with a group of people in a ceremony. And it's in those religious groups that you can find recurring community, perhaps integration. So I want to ask you all, as people approaching psychedelics from the clinical angle and the clinical research angle for treatment of particular indications, how do you see yourself fitting with that other side of things that is perhaps a greater volume of access, and that other side of things being the religious side?
I would say that it's interesting because it's been clicking for me all through our conversation. Like, this is why I'm so interested in the relational aspects of the healing with psychedelics, and why, I'm doing dyadic work with folks. And so that they have their support network there with them, and we're able to work with that network. And one of the studies we're planning is a group study with psilocybin. So that being able to work with those frames of being able to have community embedded within it, but even within the frame of where we're working from at the moment, which is a clinical trial. So adding those components in to not kind of divorce it from the experience that many people are actually already having with psychedelics, and finding useful and finding fruitful in those experiences.
I would say that the ayahuasca group, or the neo-shamanic model, is probably not the model that will be a template for bringing those therapies into Western post-modern societies. Let's reflect a little bit about what they do. These models, they often bring shamans from non-Western communities into Western societies. They often use substances from the Amazon, often a non-sustainable model of producing these substances, and often create marginalized groups with a very strong group cohesion that where a lot of people have troubles in finding their way into contexts where they sometime to earn a living have to go back. So to put it a little bit more provocative, I think the ritualistic model, learning from the elders, is something that has a very hard time in the kind of society we are living in. Globalized, digitalized, very, very fast, people moving from one city to another several times in their lives. So both the communities, but also the languages, the frameworks, the models that are used for understanding, for reinterpreting, for making use of psychedelic experience. It's hard to only learn that from people who try to transfer it from indigenous contexts, which never had the kind of experience that people are confronted with here. I think the dialogue and also let's say that the debate about the usefulness of these contexts for Westerners has only begun. It's not to diminish what comes from these indigenous communities, not at all, but we are also exploiting their resources in a way that for many is not sustainable here, and just creates a dreamscape that is not helping everybody.
Thank you for that, Hendrik. Really well put. I hadn't thought that deep into how to adapt the indigenous model to the Western world, and assumed that because we have this religious use modality, it was going to develop and adapt itself to the Western world, perhaps through the adaptation of the religious structures themselves into more for-profit organizations. And an example of that I can give you is an organization I know that likes to grow and produce and distribute their psychedelic plant medicines themselves. And they are in the West, but they are a quasi-religious organization. And in that model, you have a kind of a sustainable production, sustainable distribution, and yet you have a very religious context and a strong community. So they've taken cues from this indigenous side of things, and they've integrated into the Western way of living and the Western way of thinking, but nevertheless remain very involved in this lineage, you could say, this religious lineage. And so that's an example of the adaptation of the indigenous model to the Western model, not necessarily sterilizing it into the full clinical setting, but having somewhere in between.
Can I ask you back, Jesse? You're using the term religious models. Are you sure that a lot of these indigenous communities have religions?
I mean, that's a really good question, because I would argue yes, for the purpose of religious freedom legislation. The idea is that in order to get protection under the laws of the EU and the laws of the US, the laws of Canada, you have to have a legitimate religious exercise. And unless you have a legitimate religious exercise, you're not protected under freedom of religion laws. So even though we may say as intellectuals, as anthropologists, oh, they have an inchoate spirituality of shamanism that isn't necessarily formalized into a religion, the reality is as lawyers, as semanticists, we must choose the words that we use to argue our case very carefully, because those words trigger particular regulations. And on that note, part of an organization called, various organizations involved with sacred plants that are some in stealth and some not in stealth. And they're focused on creating a formalized system for this decentralized, disorganized religion of shamanism in order to gain those legal protections that are necessary to protect their practice.
I wanted to, oh, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to add to the conversation, and yeah, I appreciate your commentary and thoughtful critique, Henrik, about these, about many groups who bring indigenous practices into the West in such a way that's problematic. I think there's a lot of that happening. But Jesse, I think you're naming some of the ways that I think it can happen in a sort of support of our Western world, and responding to a real need for more community gatherings and coming together in a spiritual way. And the thing I wanted to add to that is the importance of reciprocity in doing that. And there are some organizations who, I think, rather than just taking and leaving the indigenous cultures without resources, actually give back and really support the cultures that they're working with. One such example is the Church of Sacred Nature, who does a lot of activism to support the indigenous culture in Colombia, where they come from. And I've just been really impressed by their thoughtfulness and care and respect in the ways that they're bringing the work forward and the ways that they're giving back. So I do think it's possible. And I think that the type of work that we're doing can sort of work in harmony alongside of some of these groups, where we can bring community offerings to our clients. And also, we're not a religious organization, and so aren't going to have the same kind of ultimately, community setting that a church might have. And so I do think there are a lot of potential for collaboration there.
Yeah, I think that really speaks to the need for humility in this work, and a recognition of the work and the effort and the knowledge that's come before. And I think that especially when I'm seeing this enthusiasm right now for what's next, or opportunity, or different for-profit ventures that are starting in this space. And when I hear things like the first, the biggest, world leading, all these whatnot, it really brings up something for me, because it's like, hold on, the whole point is for us to be tapping into, first of all, the things that are internal to each of us, but also that have come from many, many, thousands of years of knowledge and work with these different medicines. And even if it's a new medicine, for example, like MDMA is a newer medicine in the grand scheme of things, that it's tapping into, all doors lead to the same place. It's tapping into very similar things. So I think that's one thing, that approach of paying respect, really, and also like learning from what has come before and taking that forward with humility and thoughtfulness and alignment is really important.
All doors lead to.
Can I ask you, are you arguing for the re-traditionalization as a model of spreading or distributing psychedelic therapy practices? Do you think that's a sustainable model? And maybe second question, as personal question, as a scientist, I'm very much about trying to create, together with people, secular ways of spiritualities that don't push people into metaphysical concepts that come from all over the world, that are collected by New Age groups, not rooted in any social practice, but just treated as, that's where I get to you again, Jesse, so that as religions, like frameworks of almost ideologies that are then, for legalization issues, even pushed further into religious ideologies. By the way, a model that is very, very American. We don't have a lot of these religious freedom laws in European states for historical reasons. So I'm just concerned about the lack of care for secular philosophies and understanding of the world in a way that people can translate to where they come from, and that is more about being here in this world with this nature and not about post-European metaphysics re-imported from the Amazon.
I can answer that first question, Henrik, that you're posing around if I'm advocating for re-traditionalization, which I'm definitely not. I mean, given I work with MDMA, there isn't really a tradition to go off of, right, on that, other than what has been used by other practitioners. But what came to mind is actually this idea of, for example, as scientists, we cite each other, right? We don't claim that what we've developed is our own or new if it's not, right? It builds on.
We don't even claim that it is true.
Right, exactly.
Religious claims are often about truth, and scientific claims are often about probability.
Or a possibility, right?
Possibility,
it's the idea that that's a possibility, or that this is a thing that we should keep looking at, or we can investigate, or we know doesn't cause harm in this way. And so that for me is more kind of the philosophy I'm bringing to it, is this it's almost like the citation, right? Like you build on what has come before, and you give credit where it's due, and you take the learnings that create something bigger and bigger and bigger and better. And so that's where I'm coming from with that.
Well, in the name of citation, in building on something that came before, I submit to you that outside of hunting and gathering, the original profession, well, there are really two that people say were the original profession. One is prostitution. The other is shamanism. And the original professionals, specialists within the tribal context, were shamans that eventually became the alchemists, that eventually became the chemists, that eventually became the scientists. And so if you trace back that lineage of science all the way back to its inchoate stage, you may find a shaman sitting there. And so I ask really this question to address the concern for lack of care for the secular world in this framing of psychedelic use as a spiritual and perhaps religious pursuit. Is there somewhere where those two things blend together? Perhaps way back when, and perhaps way in the future, or even in the place where all the doors lead to, here and now. So I think that might be it. We have some time for some closing thoughts, and then we'll move to Q&A. Or if no closing thoughts, we can move to Q&A.
Hi there, I'm Samantha here, one of the organizers. So I'll help you guys talk through the Q&A. Thank you all for your very interesting insights. This is a whole new world for me. I don't know a lot about this space, so thank you for sharing. So just to the attendees, whoever has any questions, do raise your hand and I can unmute you, and you can feel free to ask your question. There was a question that came through by Mir Galmidi. So it was a question about, since religion is a shroud of protection, do you feel it should not be the focal point of the experience? I think that was asked midway through that discussion.
So in the work that I have been doing, I think it's an interesting one, because we don't ever put a frame of spirituality or religion on any of our work. However, it emerges for some folks within their experience. And so we would never steer them away from that. We would be there to be with them and help them explore as they see fit and as it emerges. So I think within that idea, it's like we would, from our lens of the work we're doing, we would never impose that on anyone or claim any orientation or like philosophy around that, but work with whatever comes from that person.
Cool. Are there any other questions?
I'd love to speak a little bit more to that thought. And I think you have a real scientific evidence that psychedelics occasion a mystical type experience. There's even one of the seminal papers of the recent boom in psychedelic science is titled, Psychedelics Can Occasion Mystical Type Experiences. And so you have there something that is the focal point of the psychedelic experience, which is the classical mystical type experience of union with the universe. That often leads to religion, that religion is built around. That's the seed of all religion, right? This mystical experience of divine union. I submit that there should be a focal point in the psychedelic experience that has some smattering of religion, but doesn't capture what religion, the word, does, which is this binding of the self towards this other system. The religio coming from the word like ligament, to bind, to tie together. So it shouldn't be ignored that there's a mystical aspect, potentially, to the psychedelic experience. But that mystical aspect, I think, should be explored within scientific terminology.
Maybe it's interesting at this point of the discussion to mention that debate around the term mystical and how we measure or describe mystical experience in psychedelic therapies. If you talk to the colleagues at Johns Hopkins, they use a questionnaire. They use the questionnaire quite often, which is called the Mystical Experience Questionnaire. When you dive deeper into it, there is no unified description of mystical here. It's rather it's a little bit a foggy term that we should maybe avoid in describing what people in psychedelic experience really seem to experience. So sometimes mystical type experiences can be experiences of connectedness to the self, to others, or to nature or the cosmos. Sometimes they can be experiences of awe, the bigger than me, bigger than life experiences. Sometimes they can be experiences of selflessness, ego death-like experiences. So I doubt very much that narrative from the 1960s, 70s, that psychedelics lead you into mystical experience and that cures people, is the end of what we find out in the scientific endeavors that a lot of groups now are involved in. Let's take a closer look at what people do when they use the word mystical, and maybe it's like a question of performance. Sometimes people use the word mystical, and by that they try to say, I don't mean rational, or I don't mean rationalization, or I don't mean pure intellectualism, or there is something mysterious to life. But do we need the term, the religious phrase, mystical, for understanding what people experience there and also appreciating what they experience there? Question mark.
It's a very scientific response, because I think about a compound, for example. It's made up of its constituent elements. Similarly, mystical as a word is a compound made up of these constituent elements: oneness, union, connectedness. And it's looking at those constituent elements that we can really get to the bottom of the truth, or get at a hypothesis to what the truth may be that we can test.
We've got another question. Pete McCarthy.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you for the discussion. Really wonderful discussion. My question is, shouldn't we just be advocating for the complete legalization of these, because they can be taken responsibly by adults, and let them come to their conclusions and have discussions amongst each other? I mean, we have examples of hallucinogenics being, used by human beings for thousands of years. We know that whatever the experience is, they can be used responsibly, and people should come to their own conclusions. So shouldn't we just advocate for the legalization of these?
I can take this one as a lawyer who advocates for the legalization of psychedelics. It's happening already, right? You have decriminalization movements all across the US that have already passed. It is the first step towards legalization, similar to cannabis. Secondarily, the religious language precipitates this idea that the Controlled Substances Acts don't apply to entheogenic substances. That's the position.
Right. It's a great, I mean, it sounds like a great avenue to go there. And we have religious freedom, so we can choose to use these things if we choose to have those conscious experiences.
Then I want to put this question to the rest of the panelists, because how does that fit with you as a clinician, as a scientist that wants to make sure that these things are used for the right reasons and under the right regulatory framework?
Yeah, I think one thing that comes to mind is it's depending on why and how you're using it, right? So I think, for example, if someone with PTSD is looking for treatment of the PTSD using a psychedelic or using MDMA, then we continue to need to demonstrate and show the safety, the efficacy, the effectiveness of using this tool for the treatment of this thing. So it still stands that we need to be rigorous and thoughtful in the work that we're doing and the standards that we're holding around how to do treatment. And I think treatment is different than the open use of psychedelics for personal growth and exploration. I think that's a separate, those are two different things.
But aren't they both equally valid?
I do believe so, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, because to answer your question, I will drop acid when I choose that it's the right time in my life to explore a different way of thinking and go for a walk in the woods. That's not as dangerous as eating a slice of pepperoni pizza. So, you know, I mean, I think we need to.
Can I ask you something? Can I ask you something? Actually, in most Western societies, if you're not living in a very, very extreme totalitarian, authoritarian state, you can drop acid whenever you want to. The black market.
People who make it, there's people who make it that are in prison.
Yeah, but that's actually not happening a lot in most of the countries that are enforcing these laws in a rational way. Or if you look at the Portuguese model of decriminalization, that works actually well. So
it doesn't allow people to teach use of that, though.
If you look at traditionalist societies, they are very, very different from what we have here and right now. So I had the opportunity to follow a shaman from the Shipibo tribe for 7 years and have been interviewing him over a long period of time. And he was telling stories about their use of psychedelics in their tribal context. And it's very far from the peace and harmony oriented and healing ways that we often think about.
Shamans using.
Sorry, I think there's another question.
I just would like to say just one thing. Sorry, shamans using psychedelics is only one example of humankind has been using psychedelics for thousands of years. Whether it's in a shamanic tradition or just a human being in a field eating a mushroom, it doesn't have to be through that avenue to use the thing.
Well, on that, there's this really great quote that I want to share to wrap that point up. And it's from Wade Davis, who's an anthropologist and student of ethnobotany, student of the great father of ethnobotany, Richard Evans Schultes. And he said, when Schultes asked a shaman how often the people drank ayahuasca, the shaman's response suggested that the question had no meaning. During illness, of course, and in the wake of death, in times of need or hardship, at certain passages in life, when a young boy of 6 has his first haircut or when he kills for the first time. And naturally, the shaman suggested, a youth will drink it at puberty. As a young man, he may drink at his leisure to improve his hunting technique or to simply flaunt his physical prowess. The message that Schultes received was that the Kofan took yahe, ayahuasca, whenever they felt like it, at least once a week, and no doubt on any occasion that warranted it.
We're living in a society with with 780 novel and existing psychoactive substances. It's so different from these contexts in which something like social liberalism and libertarianism did not exist at all. Extreme social pressure, extreme forms of telling people where to go to, when to go to, what to use and what not to use. Extreme forms of treating what we in our societies would often diagnose as psychotic forms of behaviors, sometimes even killing people. So I just feel the necessity to add a little bit of more anthropological descriptions to traditional societies than we often use in when we just try to use it for our own reasons and practices. So these societies were very different from ours. We can learn in certain aspects, but I think we can't just use them as a template for our societies.
We've got Preston here who has a question. Preston?
Hi, thank you for the opportunity. So the legal code in Western democracies, they don't actually have a language for these experiences outside of what has already been codified as religion. So rather than first attempt to rewrite the legal code in a way that does justice to these experiences, that actually transcend all religions and really transcend language, is this group of leaders willing to compromise on an ideal legal description of what it is in exchange for being offered an imprecise vehicle for legal integration into Western culture? And what are the risks in doing so?
Who would like to answer? Anne?
You just volunteered yourself, Hendrik.
Yeah.
If you want me to, I have some ideas on that. I think the development of legal codes and finding new forms of laws for... Hey, are we still here? Something's happening?
We're still here. Somebody accidentally pressed screen share, so we can.
I think that might be Mark. Maybe we can just wait a little bit before we wrap this up. We've got another like 5 minutes of this panel. Thanks.
I want to make it short. My ideas are that it makes a lot of sense to go through the medical model, try to make clear that therapeutic ways of using these substances work also in Western societies. Then, at least our own strategy, but maybe it works for a lot of contexts, is to make clear that healthy people can make use to get better for the betterment of people, and create data about it, tell the stories how people get better, and then take that to the lawmakers and help them frame it, because at the moment in Western societies there is no way of giving a therapeutic substance to a healthy volunteer outside of a university study. Yeah. So, but I think that is something that lawmakers are there for. We just need to make the case for it. We need to bring it, to start a discourse about it, and make a difference from recreational forms of use that are not for the benefit of people. So I think that's these are simple steps. We don't have to rely a lot on religious forms of language or codification in this model. It's just a step by step showing to society that this works.
I want to fully agree with that. That's what lawmakers are there for. You know, your question about whether there should be a compromise between an ideal legal description and imprecise vehicle for legal integration is well put. That said, that's where we are right now, right? We're doing that. We're decriminalizing. We're focusing on religious language. But lawmakers are there for helping draft the next set of laws that will ultimately govern these things in the way that they should be.
To dovetail off of both Henrik, what you said, and Jesse, what you just said, one way that we're trying to do that within the research is actually my like dream study, and what we're hoping to be developing and pushing Health Canada towards potentially accepting is this idea of doing a study with couples who don't have a diagnosis of anything, right? And so the idea that we'd be demonstrating improved relationships, improved functioning, improved quality of life. And the study that we ran before with the couples, we gave MDMA in a clinical trial to one of the partners who did not have a diagnosis of anything. And so we have evidence that that's safe, it's effective, it works. And so that's our hope of kind of forwarding that idea, but within the frameworks that we're currently operating in.
Great, thank you for, thanks for answering those questions. Thanks, Preston, for that question. I guess to wrap this up, Seb had a question for you guys, and then I'll let him wrap up the panel and introduce the next talk.
Yeah, thank you so much for this panel. It was absolutely enlightening, and I was listening very attentively to all these, and I was thinking we could have an entire conference on this very topic itself. So that's sparking some ideas here. So I mean, just to kind of bring it back to this concept of reset everything, you did touch on this a little bit during the panel, but in the context of this crisis and moving forward, how do you think that the current crisis and the lasting effects of it will impact your research potentially, either positively or negatively, and also maybe move forward or push the envelope in terms of what you guys are able to do, the types of experiments you're able to work on, and then more broadly just acceptance and at some point perhaps legalization or decriminalization of these substances in society, in Western countries at least.
Yeah, I can dive in there. Starting off with the fact that in the immediate wake of COVID, it's had, there's been a pull in two different directions from my experience. The first is slowing this work down quite a bit. The MAPS research that I'm taking part in right now has had to pretty much pause taking on new participants currently, and it's unclear when we're going to be able to start taking people in again because the psychedelic assisted therapy in general requires person-to-person contact. So we've been with the ketamine assisted therapy field, we've been kind of thinking together as colleagues around the possibility of offering virtual therapy or supported at-home treatments, but they're not ideal. So it has, on some level, slowed down the work. On the other hand, there's been an increased need for support right now as people are isolated at home and really struggling and scared about the future and what's going to happen. And so there are a lot of people out there needing support. So it's been something we've been grappling with. How do we support people in the ways that they're needing while also keeping them safe? I can imagine, given how much is kind of breaking down in terms of structures right now, how much is being questioned in terms of our current paradigms, that openness to this work may start to evolve, and that more and more people will, I think, develop some level of acceptance or interest in what we're doing here. Curious to hear what others think.
I totally agree with you, Jesse. That's exactly the experience we've had. We don't have an active study running right now, and I've never been so grateful to not have one running because we haven't had to stop. But we're already seeing just clinically we saw the downturn as people were trying to figure out what was happening, and suddenly we've seen this massive uptick in people reaching out for services, needing them, and we're not even through COVID right now. And so I'm anticipating a massive boom of folks wanting and needing services afterwards, and that they are already looking towards psychedelic assisted therapies as a tool. And so I'm anticipating that the research that we'll run next, our offerings clinically, will be well needed as soon as people can get close together again.
So over here, the general perception of the vulnerability, not only of us as human beings, but also of our systems, of our economies, of our living together, seems to open discussions about new ways of treating mental health. So we have them with people at the moment who never talked about the possibility of psychedelic therapies before, because they see that things in the building up of that crisis didn't work as well as they thought. So the hypnosis of that we're going into a bright, progressive future might stop or might not be as strong as it has before after this crisis, and that might help.
And here we are in very rough seas. In fact, this ship may be sinking. And psychedelics, like cryptocurrency, I view as a lifeboat. And there's really no better way to hit the reset button than to have a psychedelic experience. So in the name of resetting everything, you got your solution right there.
That's great note to end it on, Jesse. Thanks so much. Thanks everybody. Thanks, Genesee, Anne, and Henrik for this amazing panel. Thank you.